I am convinced that there is a reason there are so many lawyers in America. And that reason, in reflection, has very little to do with the fact that many parents view being a lawyer as the only acceptable alternative after you have not managed to get into medical school. There are so many lawyers because there are so many laws. Now, some might say that I've got that backwards, but I'm convinced I have it right. There are so many lawyers because there are so many laws. Let's just look at American federal law for a second, at the United States Code. I don't claim to even coming close to fully understanding, but here is what little I managed to pluck off the internet over the course of this last week. Every law passed by Congress gets plugged into one of 50 titles in the USC, the United States Code, which logically sorts out American law into different categories. The highest level categories are called titles, which are divided into subtitles, which are divided into chapters, which are divided into subchapters, which are divided into parts, which are divided into sections. And reading that as a Presbyterian, I found it strangely exciting. For example, there are 50 different titles. Title 26, let's pick one based on last week's sermon, which has to do with taxes. Title 26 has to do with revenue and taxation. Let's imagine for a second that you had this deep and burning desire to learn more about when you would have to file a special addendum to your federal return. For that, you would look to Title 26, Subtitle F, Chapter 61, Subchapter A, Part 1, Section 6001. And it's tell you everything you need to know. Wait, is that Section 6002? You know, I always get this muddled when I'm trying to remember. It's a vast amount of law. How many laws are there? Well, Title 26, this is one of 50 titles. If you put it into hardbound copy, it's 7,500 pages long. And unfortunately, it's a page turner. Keep you up all night if you get into it. I mean, when you get to Title 26, Subtitle 5, Chapter 37, Subchapter B, Part 1, Section 7042, you're just not going to believe the plot twist there. I mean, it's just like, I read it, like, I did not see that coming. And it sets you up for the sequel in Title 27. But don't worry, I'm not going to give you a spoiler. The volume of American law is just dizzying. Hundreds, thousands of pages of code are just more than any one human being or even entire law schools full of human beings can come to terms with. And I know they say that ignorance of the law is no excuse, but how could you ever be fully aware of the laws that govern our country? Even if you spent your whole life, an entire lifetime, studying, and you set every neuron in your brain to be dedicated to learning them, including the neurons that you currently use to know how to eat, how to breathe, and how to use at least most universal remotes. Even if you did that, you'd never be able to take in all of that information. It's too much. And when regulations and requirements reach that level of complexity, it becomes really hard for us to know, how do we relate to them? How do they relate to us? How do we apply them to our lives? They're just so complicated. Now, for the ancient Hebrews, being a much smaller society, the law was still a big deal, but it was, thankfully, much less complex. The scholars of Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, which contain the basic Jewish people figured that there were 613 total commandments, things that were required in Hebrew society. That seems more manageable. Now, 248 of these were things that you had to do. And the ancient rabbis believed that those matched perfectly with the 248 parts of the body. I tried to figure out how that worked last night, but I couldn't figure out how they divided this up. They also said that there were 365 things you were not supposed to do. Basically, matching it out, there's one thing you're not supposed to do every day of the year. And you'll have to figure out what specifically that is today. Now, compared to the United States Code, learning Torah was a comparative cakewalk. I mean, still, that's 613 things you have to know, and you have to know how they relate to each other. You have to know how they relate to your life. You have to know how to interpret them. And the complexities of those 613 laws of Torah were such that they consumed the thoughts of many Jewish scholars in the time of Christ. Now, in Jesus' time, those people were called Pharisees. These are the people who weren't worshiping up in the temple. They spent all day long sitting in the synagogue arguing about what this law meant, what that law meant. We hear today about how one of those Pharisees asked Jesus a very pointed question. The Sadducees, as we've heard in the last couple of weeks, had really been trying to figure out a way to trip up Jesus with their questioning, and they had failed. The Pharisees figured it was their turn to give it a shot, and one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question about the law. Now, it is a lawyer, but by lawyer we have to understand something different. This is more like a biblical scholar, because the law and the Bible were basically the same thing. This lawyer challenges Jesus to come up with a judgment call about the law. And it's an interesting question. You've got 613 laws. Which is the greatest commandment in the law? How do you prioritize? And Jesus does not have any trouble at all with this question. He knows his stuff. He responds immediately with a quotation from Torah, from Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your mind. It's a good answer. One that would have been brought up in every Jewish liturgy. For that is the second part of the highest prayer in all of Judaism, Shema, that call to listen for God's word. And now that's the commandment, right? I mean, he was asked, which is the greatest? Which is the one greatest commandment? And he's responded. He's given him that one greatest commandment. The answer is right there. But Jesus then doesn't stop. He gives the guy the greatest commandment, but he does not finish with his response. He says, yes, this is the first and greatest commandment as I see it. But it's not alone in making that claim on people's lives. He makes sure to say there is another lives. He makes sure to say there is another